Before the Miranda decision, criminals and suspects were given few rights and were often presumed to be guilty. They were rarely informed of their rights upon arrest, and some were even beaten and held at gunpoint by police during an interrogation. However, in 1966, Ernesto Miranda appealed to his case to the Supreme Court on the grounds that he had not been informed of his rights upon the arrest. The decision in his favor led to the developments of the Miranda warning. This legal revolution has triggered significant reforms in the care and the treatment of the accused. The Miranda warning is intended to protect the suspect's Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer self-incriminating questions and their Sixth Amendment right to the assistance of an attorney. This court case has reformed the justice system upon arrest and interrogation, has stimulated the public reaction that the Miranda warning has given criminals and suspects rights they do not deserve, and has revolutionized the treatment of criminals. The revolution of criminals' rights all started with the assault of a young woman. One day, walking home from work, a man by the name Ernesto Miranda grabbed her and proceeded to rape her. This criminal act was the beginning to a case that would be made famous worldwide. Miranda was brought to the station for interrogation. However, authorities withheld all information from him. Miranda was never told his Fifth or Sixth Amendment rights. This was a key factor that would change the entire theme of the case against him. Earl Warren was the Supreme Court Justice at this time. He worked on civil liberties and rights for minorities. His legal philosophy was opposed to the laissez-faire doctrine that had earlier prevailed. He had a realistic understanding of the debilitating effects of racial segregation. In 1939, he was on his way to campaign for the district attorney. During this time, his father was murdered, and since then, Warren vowed to pursue strict law enforcement. He was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Eisenhower. During his period as justice, he made many changes in the areas of race relations, criminal procedure, and legislative appointment. Miranda v. Arizona was one of his biggest cases. This case formed the now well-known Miranda rights. When Ernesto Miranda was arrested, it didn't take long for the authorities to get a confession out of him. They assumed he knew his constitutional rights, but they never clearly stated them to him. This would become the foundation of the case, Miranda v. Arizona. The assumption that Miranda hadn't been clearly given his rights would spur a revolution in criminal procedure. Dating all the way back to colonial times, prosecutors have abused the prosecution powers they've been given. They've used their powers to tyrannize populations and imprison or destroy political enemies. This injustice of power led up to the case known as Escobedo v. Illinois. In this case, the suspect, Danny Escobedo, was interrogated unfairly, and as well as his attorney never read him his rights. The statement he gave was then used against him as evidence in the case. After being arrested, he petitioned to the Supreme Court that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. His conviction was reversed on the platform that he had not been warned of his constitutional rights. This case was essential to the Miranda rights decisions because it would directly lead to the Miranda v. Arizona ruling. In Escobedo, it was decided that the Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights had to be read to the prosecuted. However, it wouldn't be until Miranda v. Arizona that the question of who was responsible of reading these rights would be answered. When Ernesto Miranda was first sent to the court, he faced charges of rape and kidnapping, both of which would compute to 20 to 30 years in jail. As a result of not knowing his rights, the question if Miranda's statement was made voluntarily rose. After months of debate and decisions in lower courts, the Supreme Court knew they would have to revisit Escobedo and clarify the situation. This intensified when Miranda filed as a pauper and submitted his plea for a writ of certiorari. Miranda's case was brought all the way to the Supreme Court. What resulted from this case were the Miranda rights, which is what follows. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Miranda rights were created in 1966 as a result of the United States Supreme Court case of Miranda v. Arizona. The Miranda warning is intended to protect the suspect's Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer self-incriminating questions. The accused can also stop the interrogation at any time. The Miranda rights, however, do not go into effect until after an arrest is made. The creation of the Miranda rights changed the relationship between citizen, state, and police suspect. Citizens now possess the right to be informed and also the assurance that their people could and would be protected from the abuse of institutional power. Suspects could now tell the police, city, state, country, or nation that they had nothing to say. This case produced paradoxical results. It was accused of coddling criminals since it unnecessarily restricted the police to try and control a rising crime rate. However, With the exception of a suspect not having to speak, the Miranda rights ended up actually strengthening the police force. It did so by making the scope and thoroughness of investigations more professional. Now confessions would be based on hard evidence instead of questionable confessions. The Miranda rights made it so that now the public is protected by a more professional police force.
After this case, an entire criminal prosecution revolution evolved. Many other cases used the Miranda rights. 5 years after Miranda, the Supreme Court decided Harris v. New York. With only 2 of the 5 justices in the original Miranda majority still on the court, the Supreme Court said that a statement taken in violation of Miranda could be used to impeach the credibility of a defendant at trial. The police in the case failed to inform Harris of his right to counsel prior to custodial interrogation, which was a violation of the Miranda. However, the prosecution did not use the statements made by Harris during the case in chief, but when he took the stand, he contradicted his post-arrest statement. The Supreme Court approved of the prosecution using the post-arrest statement to charge the defendant during cross-examination. The court was not going to let the defendant use the Miranda decision as a license to commit perjury. In a case, Michigan v. Tucker, a man Tucker, while in custodial interrogation, was advised of the Miranda warnings, but not the right to an appointed counsel. The Supreme Court decided that derivative evidence, such as the witness's identity, might be suppressed, but only if the police acquired it by infringing on the defendant's constitutional rights. The Tucker court case made it clear that the Miranda warnings are not rights protected by the Constitution, but are simply measures verbalized by the court to guarantee that the right against compelled self-incrimination is protected. Oregon v. Elstad was a case regarding a man, Elstad, who was suspected of burglary and arrested. While in handcuffs, Elstad said something self-incriminating. This was before he had been read his Miranda rights. Later, Elstad signed a written confession that was convicted in court. The court excluded his first statement, but had trouble deciding whether the confession would be used or not. The debate had so much controversy that it ended up being sent to the Supreme Court. The year 1990 brought a case, Illinois v. Perkins. While in jail, Perkins confessed his murder to a fellow inmate without the knowledge that the inmate to which he was speaking was actually an undercover officer. The question rose of whether the police violated Perkins' Miranda rights, since Perkins had no idea that he was under some sort of interrogation. It was decided in court that confessions are not an important part of interrogation, and that it had not been a violation of the Miranda rights. A most recent and well-known case, the case of Lisa Nowak, in 2007, presented the issue of questioning confessions. Lisa Nowak, a former astronaut, drove 1,000 miles to assault a woman, Colleen Shipman, who liked the same pilot as Lisa. Colleen was attacked with pepper spray, but managed to get away. It was a dicey case, and the judge of it, Judge Mark L. Lubit, decided to throw away Lisa's comments made in a 6-hour interrogation since she claimed she had not been read her Miranda rights. Miranda v. Arizona has reformed the justice system upon arrest and interrogation. Miranda rights have stimulated the public reaction that the Miranda warning has given criminals and suspects rights they do not deserve. Finally, it has revolutionized the treatment of criminals. Without this case, criminals' Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights would not be clear, and the treatment of criminals would not be fair. This case has revolutionized modern interrogation and casework.